So with that being said, I'll be transitioning into our first session, talking about Area R15 grants. So here are the loose logistics for this session, approximately 60 minutes. With that is our question and answer. So again, don't feel like you have to wait until the end. Please ask questions as they become relevant. And all the presentation materials will be made available to you, as Tom mentioned, in addition to today's recording. One other thing I want to say as a disclaimer, my slides are very wordy. I understand that's not great pedagogy. I understand, I get it. But the reason why I do that is so people have the information in hand. So I don't intend to read a dissertation to you guys today, but I want it to be that when we're done today, you have a reference point, you have the meat in between what we talked about to reference. And I've integrated very heavily throughout the presentation hyperlinks such that it takes you to that resource, or it takes you to, that database or whatever to help you with your funding pursuits. So let's begin by talking about the NIH, shall we? So the National Institutes of Health was established in the 1800s, initially as the laboratory of hygiene in the U.S. Public Health Service. And much of this initial work was done on infectious disease research. So it was like one room, one lab, and they did a lot of infectious disease research. And if you can imagine, what was happening in the late 1800s going into the early 1900s, when we were around, a lot of infectious diseases were impacting communities, wiping out neighborhoods at times, being very, very serious public health concerns. So that was the primary focus. And one room was like the basis for doing research, developing things like vaccinations and things like that to support the United States in their fight against these very intense infectious diseases. So that was the initial work. And then it kind of expanded into doing other aspects of health, other aspects of medicine. The National Cancer Institute, the NCI, was the first institute that was established. And as we'll talk a little bit more throughout the day, the NIH itself is composed of multiple institutes and centers. And each of those institutes and centers have very but they have their individual areas of focus, such that there's the research that's happening. NIH is one of the federal agencies that actually does research on site. So they do their own research in addition to supporting research in the community, supporting research via grants and cooperative agreements. That's not the case for the NSF. So there are no NSF labs per se. All of NSF, and we'll talk about the NSF this afternoon, 90% or 95% of their annual allocation goes to funding research being done by the community. So there's no in-house stuff. There's no NSF lab that's developing anything. Everything is via a cooperative agreement. We're funding a laboratory and they're doing the work. We're funding individual researchers or institutions and they're doing the work. I keep saying we, I need to not do that. They are. But coming back to the NIH, again, late 1800s into the 1900s, just vastly growing in response to what's happening in society during that time, what's happening in the communities during that time. And so as the NIH began to develop, new institutes were being stood up and having different areas of focus. And so today, the National Institutes of Health is composed of 27 institutes and centers, and they cover a wide range of research topics. And so I really want to emphasize that, because usually when we think about like biomedical research or NIH type research, we think about cancer research or, infectious disease research or things like that. And what you'll find, hopefully, or have an appreciation for if you don't already, is there's such a broad range. You don't necessarily have to be a clinical research scientist. You don't necessarily have to be working on diseases. You don't necessarily have to be working on developing cures and things like that. There's an aspect at the NIH that supports justice research. There's an aspect at the NIH that looks at things such as social health, social determinants of health, Via my work with Hanover, I've had the opportunity to see proposals on housing inequities come through for the NIH. I've had the opportunity to receive proposals on care and treatment. So you might not necessarily be a bench scientist that's developing that cure, but if you're looking at maybe adult care, elderly care, things like that. So it's not just kind of things that you would do in a traditional science lab, but there's other aspects of research that are supported via the NIH. It's just about recognizing where. And so one of the things that I'll tell you later on, and we'll talk a little bit more about later on, but as a spoiler alert, one of the best ways to figure out if your interest or your concept aligns with the NIH is to see what the NIH is already funding. So there is the NIH reporter system where you can search by keyword, utilize certain filters. You can see what's already been funded. You can see currently active awards, previously active awards. You can see where at the NIH. So for example, if you do something, again, health equity, but not necessarily a cure or a treatment, but health equity, or you do some justice work, put in those keywords for your topic, and you'll see abstracts for what's been funded already and where. So I think that's the thing, recognizing the where. So you might think, oh, I think this has some health context, but I'm not sure. See what institute or center funded that previously funded award and pursue that. And one of the good things about those searches is it'll give you in that not only the title, the who, the where, but the cognizant program officer. So that'd be a really, really good person to contact. If you're like, I think my thing could align with this center, let me contact the cognizant program officer listed and reach out to them, share my concept, and we'll talk about how you share your concept in an upcoming slide. But that's kind of the best ways to approach any of these agencies. Because if they funded it before, then that means it aligns with their mission in some shape or form, and you need to figure out how you can align your thing with their mission as well. So we're going to begin by talking about the Academic Research Enhancement Award, so AREA, which is an award issued by the NIH via the R15 mechanism. There are two types of R15. This one is going to be highlighted because its primary focus is on promoting research at undergraduate focused institutions, which I think Radnor qualifies. And so supporting what we call smaller scale research with the primary objective of getting undergraduate students actively involved in research, because it's a high impact practice, right? So you know that if you can get students, whether it be via your own lab setting or through cure classes, access to research or research skills, you're promoting them or giving them the opportunity to learn new skills. You're preparing them for the workforce, which is a good thing as well, and one of your potential outcomes of your project. And so looking more closely at this mechanism will allow you to have an appreciation for the fact that, I was one of those undergraduates that did cancer research. My sophomores, do they call them sophomores? No. Yeah, sophomore, I don't know. I'm so old, right? I was like, my second year. I don't know if they call them sophomores anymore. I was doing breast cancer research, and that's why I come back to that example often. I was doing breast cancer research my sophomore year of college. My parents couldn't believe it, right? They're like, yeah, right, whatever. I'm like, no, they're paying, I was getting paid during the school year. I was getting a stipend, $1,000 a month, and I was doing breast cancer research, and it blew my parents' mind. And, it was special to me because obviously I felt like I was rich, but during that time as well, my grandmother was being diagnosed with breast cancer. And so I was going to visit her while she was getting treated. And I was sharing like, well, this is what I'm doing in lab. And I was sharing with her the work that I was doing, and it was just kind of connected with me in a different way. And so the area R15 mechanism allows you to, whether again, it be integrated into your courses, integrated into your scholarly agenda, and an independent lab, support undergraduate research, and that's its primary focus. And also it seeks to kind of expand the research capacity at undergraduate primarily teaching institutions. So wonderful mechanism. Up to 23 institutes support Area R15 grants, and it just depends on the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity that you pursue. The primary difference is whether or not your research has a clinical trials associated with it or not. So if there are no clinical trials, you have the choice of up to 23 institutes. If there are clinical trials, the list is slightly smaller. So being familiar kind of with where your research area lands, whether or not it involves or has a potential to involve clinical aspect, clinical trials or not, you kind of have a wide range of disciplines and subject areas to pursue. There's approximately 1,200 funded active projects at NIH right now under this mechanism, and a third are supported through the NIGMS. So here is the list of all the institutes. So you can kind of take a scan and see Institute on Aging, Allergy and Infectious Diseases, all the way down to Children's Health, Communication Disorders. So that's another area that people don't always associate with when they think of NIH. Mental health, environmental health. And so again, you're not necessarily that, biochemist that's doing lab research, and that's the person that they're targeting via this mechanism. There are a number of spaces and areas and types of research that are supported via this mechanism. So again, it's just about identifying where your concept or your scholarship aligns. And then before we talk a little bit more about the R15, I'm going to talk about the R15, but I'm going to just tell you a little bit of how it differs from the R01, which is what people are most familiar with when it comes to the NIH. So on the right-hand side here, we have just kind of some fast facts about the R15 mechanism. And then on the left-hand side, the R01. So focusing primarily on R15, their primary impact that they're looking for is publishable, disseminated data, important contributions to the fields of research, and primary focus being that they want to see undergraduates being involved in that work. And so looking more closely at how we can get there with the support of undergraduates. That doesn't mean you can't engage graduate students. You can pay graduate students off of R15 grant, but most of your effort needs to be, and most of your funding, if you're supporting students, needs to be geared towards undergraduate students. Scope, they're looking for a very, very specific scope, limited scope, because they recognize you're not a research intensive institution for the most part, right? So you don't necessarily have the established facilities, the access to large, pockets of funding and things like that. So they're looking for a very narrow, limited scope, focused. And the primary thing that's in discussion, so yes, they talk about the science during the review process, but the primary thing is how are they engaging the students? What does that mentorship look like? And does everything align? So the proposed programming, the budget that goes along with it, does it all align with what the student's experience is going to be, right? So they're looking about the research opportunities that are going to be created for students. So they don't necessarily want to see that you're going to let them do like a 1-week summer internship, and that's the undergraduate research component, but then you and your master's student and a postdoc are going to do everything else. They don't want to see that. They want to see that students are actively engaged throughout the course of the research, including contributing to co-authoring publications as the data starts to come out. And so you want to be intentional about how you describe that, because that's going to be very important. You also is going to want to describe how the award itself and creating these opportunities for undergraduates are going to establish kind of like a research culture at your institution, strengthen, extend capacity via this funding. So all these things are what's being looked for during the R15 conversation. And it's a lot different than the R01, which is kind of a larger pocket of money, a broader scope. They're wanting to see kind of the sustained impact. And that's because they're expecting individuals that are already well established in research to pursue R01. So that's primary differences. So throughout this section, I'm going to be referencing kind of criteria, guidelines, limitations, and things like that. And these are the two notice of funding opportunities that I am referencing. So all the information is current as of these two funding mechanisms or funding opportunities. Please note again the difference between the two. The bottom one is for clinical trials. So if there's clinical trials as part of your proposal, you'll pursue the bottom one. The top one is the one that does not involve clinical trials. And the reason being for that is there's additional reporting requirements and data entry requirements for work that involves clinical trials. So the NIH is very kind of intentional about that. And so fewer institutions support that via this mechanism, because this mechanism also has smaller funding associated with it than R01. So they realize that you may or may not be able to keep up with the reporting requirements, the ethics requirements, if you're working with a smaller pocket of money. And so that's a primary difference with those two. So anytime I share, again, any award description, limitations, criteria, I'll let you know on the slide which NOFO it corresponds to. And if I'm bringing in for comparison other things, I'll make note of that as well. So a little bit more about the R15. It's a multi-year award. It's funded for up to 3 years at a time and renewable. With that being said, the maximum budget request for this is $375,000. And you request what's needed for your work. So you might not need $375,000, you might need $100,000. Tom might tell you go for the $375,000, whatever it is, you just need to make sure it aligns with the scope and scale of your project and it's sufficiently justified in the budget. And one thing that's unique about this compared to some of the other awards is if you're pursuing 375 or 250 or whatever the case may be, you request all that in budget year one. So there's no kind of annual request. So you don't have to do like a year one, year two, year three. You do year one, 375,000, and then that's it. It could be a 3-year award, but you get all your funding in year one. So that's kind of a little intricacy on that one. With that being said, this is not a training grant. So yes, you're creating research opportunities, but it's not what the NIH recognizes as a training grant. So that's going to be very important because you can't use it to, per se, give a stipend. So undergraduate research stipend, you say, hey, $1,000 a semester. You can't do that because this is not a training grant. What you can do is say, I'm going to follow my institutional policy, pay undergraduates $15 an hour?
At least, minimum.
Minimum. Yeah. I'm gonna follow my institutional policy, pay students $15 an hour. The estimated work is gonna be 30 hours during the academic year, 40 hours during, so you can give undergraduates money via that mechanism, but you can't call it a stipend and they get it whether they show up or not, because this is not a training grant. The R15 follows the typical 12-page research strategy in addition to some supplemental documents as an R01. So we're going to look at that a little bit more closely. But that research strategy, yes, you're referencing the science, but you're also talking about the student engagement piece. You're describing that very well. You're describing it with intentionality, how you're going to mentor, what the communication is going to be like, what the how many lab meetings are going to be, what's going to be the students' roles during lab meetings. Students are going to be traveling to conferences. You have to talk about all that in that 12-page research strategy, in addition to the science. And there's no limit on the number of R15s an institution can pursue, with a caveat. One of the things that makes Bradford and other institutions eligible for this institution is that, for this funding mechanism, is that they're not receiving a certain number of NIH dollars. And so if you have 10 of these and it puts you above that funding threshold, which we'll talk about in a minute, then you can't have multiple awards. But if you have, you can have as many as you need, provided that you're underneath that funding limit. And again, the reason being is this mechanism is designed to support the smaller scale research, the smaller institutions or the lesser resource institutions. So you don't have Johns Hopkins or Yale or Harvard or Princeton pursuing these awards. It's geared towards other institutions that have limited NIH funding. So 375,000, 3 years max. You ask for what you need, but you also align it with the scope and scale of the project, and you're intentional about describing undergraduate student involvement in addition to what else you hope to or want to incorporate into that. So eligibility, I made mention of that earlier. So primarily higher education institutions, it could be public, it can be private, it can be faith-based. Again, all of this information is as of the current notice of funding opportunities. Things are subject to change, but this is what we're working towards, and this is how you can probably best prepare, because I know there have been conversations and things floating around that maybe things might be deprioritized, but you don't know until it's communicated, right? So you can only work towards what's already out there. If things are deprioritized or priorities shift, when that information comes out, if it ever comes out, then you'll be responsive to that. But I feel like if you want to make the most of your time, you work with what's already, you work with your institution to follow institutional guidance, but you work with what's already out there. So part of the eligibility criteria is accredited institution, could be private, public institution. Also, primary thing is there is specific language there as far as whether or not your graduates are going into health professional degrees. And so again, they're not necessarily wanting to support these intensive research institutions that are, awarding doctorate degrees or preparing people, not medical doctorate degrees, PharmDs and things like that. They're wanting to support institutions that have students that are pursuing the sciences and not necessarily in the sense of like professional science and professional health degrees. The funding threshold for NIH funding in order to be eligible for this is $6 million per year. I think you're close.
Yeah, I wish.
Tom wishes we were close.
Be a good problem to have.
Yeah, so not quite there, but the plus in not quite being there is that you remain eligible for this competition, right? So as long as the institution does not exceed $6 million per year in NIH funding, then you are eligible PIs at an eligible institution. And again, that's what allows multiple people. So everybody in this room can pursue an R15, and if you all ask for 375,000, as long as that number does not bring the institution above 6 million, then everybody in this room can have one. Okay. And then also part of the eligibility, you have the ability to work across campuses, across institutions, and you want to be very intentional in how if you want to work across campuses or institutions, ensure that you continue to be eligible in that. So, because they're taking that into consideration as well. So if you want to partner with an institution over here, they're going to look at both your NIH dollars to ensure, even though the project might be operating out of here and primary funding here, they're going to look at both your NIH dollars to ensure continued eligibility. So you want to think about that if you do want to establish partnerships to pursue this project. And then very, very important that, again, pursuing this is you're defining undergraduate research and undergraduate focus goals of the institution. So the fact that you're conferring degrees, these students are getting, biology or biomedical sciences degrees, and they're not necessarily going directly into an MD program, but they're graduating and entering into the workforce or pursuing sciences not in a professional health route. And so that's going to be part of the continued eligibility. And what they utilize in order to document that is a signed letter from your provost or chief academic officer. So part of the application submission and why you want to, if you're thinking about this, communicate with Tom, Pam, and their office is you're going to want to get that signed letter to attest to the eligibility of the institution to pursue this award. If you fail to do that, if it's not signed, so it could be a letter without a signature, then that can cause the whole proposal to be returned without review.
Do you mind me interjecting? Yeah, we submitted R15. It was years ago whenever they enacted the letter without the provost letter. And I don't know, a couple of weeks after submission, it said your proposal is disqualified. and it didn't even make it to the next step. So it's very important. Lesson learned.
Yes, and so you wanna, and I'm gonna grab my water,
Yep.
you want to, make sure you ask early, because, provost or your chief academic officer might not appreciate being asked at the last minute to sign something that they're not fully aware of. And so, plan early, extend that hospitality and make that request, work with Tom's office to ensure that they're supporting you and getting that letter, because it is a key. It's like one of the first things they look at before they look at who it's from. And again, has to be signed.
Yeah.
So yes, it can be a wonderful letter. Yes, it can clearly describe the eligibility criteria, no signature, no review. And we've learned it the hard way. So very important. Again, one of the many reasons why it's good to start early and communicate across campus when you have these intentions. All right, so institutional eligibility is one thing, and again, on the basis of annual NIH funding, undergraduate focus, and so on. In order to be eligible to serve as a PI on R15, you must have an active ERA Commons account. You must also demonstrate that you have the necessary skills and knowledge to support the proposed research. So you can't just come out of nowhere and say, hey, I want to do breast cancer research. And you can't show that you have the skill set, the experience, and the knowledge to support students in doing the breast cancer research. So you got to demonstrate that. You also have to have your primary appointment at an institution like Radford, where it's not necessarily a health professional school, right? So this is a teaching university. It doesn't have a health professions focus. It's not like PCOM, Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, right? So they have an undergraduate program. Their primary focus is health professions, and most of the programs, although there's a general education degree, most of the programs are preparing students into those health professions fields. So you got to be an eligible institution. You also have to have PIs or PDs that have not had an active NIH grant or may not have an active NIH grant at the time of the award. So that's one of the key things that they're looking for. And again, individual PI, you can't have one R15 and say, hey, I think this is going well. You can't pursue another one consecutively within that same time frame. So you can't, in year 2, decide you're going to pursue a second one and look at something else. So provided that you meet this criteria, you are eligible to serve as a program director or program principal investigator, however you define that for your project. So if you're thinking about submitting an R15, some early steps that you want to do is you want to identify the current NOFO. As I said earlier, I referenced the 2 current NOFOs for area R15 now. That can change next month. One of the things I learned when I was at a federal agency is we only have to post things 30 days out from a deadline. So there might be a new one now and it can be due in 30 days. So you'll want to reference whatever that current one is. You want to begin drafting your aims. You want to begin communicating outward at your institution or across institutions, however it's relevant, because you'll definitely want some support. You want to have another set of eyes on what you begin to develop and things like that. If you're interested and you're not quite sure where, because you're going to have to identify which institute or center you're submitting to, you're going to do a little bit of research, do a little bit of prospecting. Use the NIH reporter system. And like I said there, you just kind of put in keywords, enter in a few filters, see what comes up. It'll tell you what institute funded, what center funded it, who the cognizant program officer is. You can screen for past awards, current awards. Also, one of the things I like about doing this, and I do this often because I'm a nerd, is it gives you an idea of language, right? So if you work on a topic and you're maybe regionally you guys discuss it utilizing a certain language, you'll kind of see, oh well, what language did they use, because this is already funded. So that means at the time the NIH supported that language, that rationale, let me make sure I'm consistent, because sometimes what you do is when you introduce new language or alternate language, you run the risk of people not being familiar with it. So if they're not familiar with it, they may or may not have an appreciation for the context, regardless of how extensive your research strategy and your documents are. So, number of things that you can gain from searching those prior funded awards. And again, it points you to who you can reach out to if you have questions. Like I said, if they're managing a portfolio with these 3 awards that look like they might be in the same realm or expertise or discipline that you're pursuing, they'd be a really good person to ask any questions about alignment of your project with their institute or their center. So the question that popped up there is, I closed with reaching out to program officers with your concepts. How many of you have ever reached out to a program officer at any agency or any foundation? If you have, raise your hand, or if you're in Zoom land, put a Y in the chat. And if you haven't, you can let me know as well by putting an N in the chat, or maybe thumbs down, you haven't yet, but you're interested in doing so, maybe. I see an N pop up there. Yeah, so it's really mixed. So one of the many things I came to appreciate while I was at the federal agency that I supported was the fact that I was there to be of support to the public, right? My salary was funded by taxpayer dollars. My primary job was to be responsive to the public. With that being said, I know sometimes when you reach out, you don't always get a good response, or if you get a response at all. I'll just say sometimes that just happens to happen. Program officers might be overburdened. They might be closing out one panel and trying to stand up another. So they may or may not respond to you right away. If they don't, I would encourage you to continue to reach out. If not them, someone else. I've had in my past life people reach out to me, and if I couldn't assist them directly, maybe because I didn't think their concept aligned with my programs, I actually introduced them to the program officers that would be more in alignment with their work. So it doesn't hurt to reach out at all. Don't be scared. Even if you get ignored, don't take it personal. Just reach out and continue to reach out, because that's their number one role, is to be responsive to the public, because the investments that are being made via the grants is taxpayer dollars, right? So all of it is to support the public. It's taxpayer dollars is coming from the public, making awards to the public. And so it's their primary responsibility to be responsive when inquiries come out. So don't be scared, just reach out. And so you want to reach out for a number of reasons. One, because you want to see if there's alignment of your project or your concept with the program or project or center or institute they support. But subsequently, you want to just kind of get a good idea of the information that's out there, get pointed in the right direction, get resources, and then just establish relationships. One of the things that I did often as a program officer is when people reached out to me, those were the same people I reached out to for panel reviews, right? So, I answered that question for them a couple months back. Hey, we're standing up a panel, would you be interested? And that's one of the things I often like to emphasize as well. One of the best ways to get insights into how to develop a proposal is to serve as a peer reviewer, whether it be a peer reviewer, ad hoc peer reviewer, or be part of a panel. And that's because you're in the room when proposals are being discussed. And I often say that you don't have to be a well-established multi-year funded PI to be a peer reviewer. And I actually didn't get my first grant until after I peer reviewed, because I peer reviewed, then I turned around and I submitted for that same competition I peer reviewed for. And that's because I had the insights, I had the discussion, I still had the template that we used for the peer review in my email when I was developing my own proposal. So that gave me such valuable insights. And then, yeah, you get a modest honorarium. It might not be enough sometimes because you put in a lot of work in those peer reviews, but I think what you gain in insight and perspective informs you a lot and can help shape your proposal development process. So yeah, just reaching out to build relationships is important as well. So looking more closely at crafting an R15 or area R15, you want to make sure that your proposed topic or idea is scientifically meaningful. You want to have a clear hypothesis, have it well justified, establish that it has potential for publishable outcomes and publishable data. And then you want to be clear about the fact that this project is meaningful. It's also feasible, given your access to resources, facilities, and things like that. So you want to all of it has to align together. You're not gonna say you're gonna do this extensive research that requires a rocket ship if you don't have a rocket ship already, right? So just being clear, you don't really want to just sell yourself, you want to sell the reality, right? And that's because that's what they're gonna be looking for. If they see that you propose sending students to the moon and they know that Radford does not have the infrastructure for that, then, you know, that's gonna be part of the conversation, right? Like, yeah, if you fund this, it's unlikely this PI is going to accomplish its outcomes. So being very clear about your plan, aligning it across the way, making it meaningful too for undergraduate students becomes very important. Setting a realistic timeline, also very important. Again, it's up to 3 years, but you want to make sure that whatever you do ask for, if it's not a 3-year project, be realistic about that, right? Because you can ask for $375,000 for 1 year. So don't think that you have to utilize the maximum award or funding duration to get the maximum amount. It has to align with your proposed plans. With that being said, give yourself a buffer too, right? All these experiments, especially if you're working with undergraduates or anyone for that matter, they don't always produce the results that you think they would the first time around. So give your, build that in. And so I think all that is part of those conversations during those review panels. Right, so they're like, they're not really going to be able to do all that in that time. Be realistic about the scope and the scale. State the timeline that's needed for the work, and then make sure that your funding request matches that. So as I mentioned, a lot of the components that I'm going to be describing are from the current notices of funding opportunity. So very, very good place to begin your work as you're getting started, being familiar with the NOFO, the different parts of the NOFO. Like I said earlier, federal agencies are very intentional. Sometimes these NOFOs are really long. These solicitations are like 40, 50 pages sometimes. That's because everything that they can utilize in the review of your proposal has to be printed. If it's not printed, they can't introduce it as part of their funding decision, right? So they can't say, oh, well, this person didn't say, this. Well, if it's not in the notice of funding opportunity, they can't have it be a criteria. And so that's why they're pretty long sometimes, but because it has useful information. So I'm old, I print it hard copy, most people are like electronic, digital. I do a hard copy and I highlight different colors and I return. I was like, oh, and even before I think about asking a question, I was like, let me make sure it's not already in here. Because usually, when I was a SASE program officer, I would be like, well, did you look at section 4? It clearly says. So now I even do that on the front end before I reach out. So your NOFO is your best friend. And it's because it contains a number of critical pieces of information. And so the next slides, we're going to talk about the application itself and some components that are required for submission. So section 4 of the current NOFO contains application and submission information, including the page limitation, required documents, and things like that. So when I have excerpts like this, it's screen printed directly from the NOFO itself, which you can, again, download or print as a PDF file. So in general, when you're preparing an NIH proposal, they have very specific formatting instructions. And yes, they will send or return without review a proposal that does not follow formatting. It might be really, really good science and has the potential to have really, really good, meaningful impacts. But if it's 10-point font, bye-bye. And you might think, oh, how are they going to know? Like, I needed to shrink it down so I can get the more information in there. They'll return it without review.
Joyce, just back to your NSF program officer days. What would you say, or what would you guesstimate the percentage of applications that were kicked out because the applicant didn't follow the instructions? Didn't even make it to peer review?
I wouldn't have a good gauge for that because it depends on the program officer that receives it, right? Some people are very, very specific. Sometimes they're like, I don't even want to read all that, send it back. So I can't say for sure.
Yeah.
How many times have you had some return without review?
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit. It was usually due to formatting and stuff like
not
that.
following the instructions. Yeah. On down to margins and Back in the day when we started out in this field, we were, it was paper. There wasn't a research.gov or grants.gov. So we had a couple of individuals in our office measurement with a ruler before we were mailing them in, just to make sure we were meeting the 1-inch margins.
Okay.
It's crazy. But I had heard, maybe not necessarily NSF specific, but through a workshop, one agency said, or one program officer said, some 30% of their applications.
Yeah, it's like I said before, the guidance, the solicitation is all they can use to evaluate you on, right? So if it's clear, nothing less than 11-point font, they're following their own guidance, right? So you can't really argue with that if they've made it available. That's why, again, it's important to read it thoroughly. And I'll just say, as a program officer, we get a lot, and I'll talk about the numbers in a few slides. We get a lot of proposals. If I knew that my load was very, very heavy and I have to check all these for compliance, and following the guidance is how I can make my stack a little bit lighter. Sometimes I was like, okay, it's not even a conversation, kick it back if they didn't follow, and that lightened my load a little bit. And sometimes I felt bad about it because I was like, oh, it would have been a good project to be reviewed and get feedback on. But I also was just like, it's in the guidance that was publicly available, so you definitely had to follow it. And like I said, when things are returned without review, we'll talk about the success of NIH proposals a little bit later, but the downfall is you've done all that work, and even if you did all that work and it was reviewed, you at least have the benefit of feedback to inform your resubmission. Something that's returned without review, you don't even have the feedback. So you're basically making once it's returned without review, you're making a decision with yourself of, do I change anything? Well, besides the formatting stuff, and resubmit. Like, you're having to kind of resubmit blindly. You don't have the benefit of that prior review because it wasn't reviewed because you had 10-point font. So you want to follow the general guidance down to the lettering, the letter spacing, and everything. When you're preparing an R15, these are the required components. So again, pretty similar to a general R01, which you might be more familiar with the exception of this has the addition of that signed provost letter. So pretty common attachments, pretty common sections, and then again, that signed provost letter. So as you're preparing, so one of the early documents that you might begin drafting is your specific aims page. So in your specific aims, what you want to do is start with an interest grabbing statement. One of the fatal flaws that I saw when I participated in NIH review panels was that they just jumped into the scientific jargon and the numbers, and I had no appreciation because that was not my field for how significant it is, right? So I had no clue. So you want to begin with an interest-grabbing statement that would appeal to a general audience. Another reason why I want to encourage you to do that is because they utilize a specific aims page to shop the proposal around before it's assigned to a study section. So you want to make sure that's as broad as possible and appeals to the general audience, right? They're not going to be experts in your field. Most of the time, even scientific review panels are interdisciplinary groups. So you don't really want to jump into it. Yes, you need to explain the science when you get there, but you don't want it to be in this condensed page, right? So start with an interest grabbing statement. You want to state what the public health relevance is early. Again, because that's aligned with the mission of the National Institutes of Health. You want to describe how either the project builds upon something or it's going to be something that differs from what's already been done. So kind of how innovative it is, how it can contribute to the field. And then you want to include a statement of need, right? So there's this gap in communication disorder research, and my proposed project is going to address that gap. So you don't want to say there's a gap and then keep going. You want to say there's a gap and my work is going to fill that gap. On the right-hand side, some things you don't want to do, which I don't like to spend a lot of time on because sometimes that's what students hear. You guys aren't students, but we're in a learning, we're learning from one another. But I do often say, like, this is the things you should do and these are the things you shouldn't do. And then that's what they remember, the shouldn't do. So as a point of reference, things that you don't want to do on the right-hand side, conversely. And so looking more closely at the research, right? So that, again, was specific aims, 1 page, 30 lines. And then the research strategy, which is the bulk of your submission. Research strategy should be organized in significance, innovation, and approach. These are in the NIH application guide. Utilize the same headers that they utilize in the guidance that they provide you. The reason why I say that, your project might have innovation integrated into the approach section. And yes, if someone read everything from beginning to end and took meticulous notes and had a good memory, they might be able to see that the innovation is integrated into the approach because it made sense to you when you were writing it. However, that's not necessarily the case during study sections, right? They're being charged with reading a stack of proposals, so multiple proposals in a short amount of time. So if they don't see that clear header that you've addressed innovation in this half-page chunk, they might say, oh, Pam doesn't have innovation. And so I'm going to score her low for that section. So utilize the headers, the subheaders, whatever they provide in the guidance, and that's across all funding agencies and even foundation. If they tell you these are the sections we need, don't remix it. Utilize those same headers because that's what the review panel, when the review panel gets their templates, they're cross-checking. So please utilize headers, use them intentionally, make it easy for people, because if they can't find it, they're just going to assume you don't have it and move on. So again, significance, innovation, and approach. The purpose of the significance section is to prove that the work is meritorious and appropriate for your undergraduate students. So you're demonstrating that, you're addressing a critical problem, a barrier in the field, you're speaking to how that proposed work is innovative and potentially transformative. You're showing how the work is going to achieve the desired aims and outcomes. And most importantly, you're demonstrating alignment with the NIH or the specific institute that you're submitting to. One of the ways I encourage PIs to do is, okay, we all know the NIH mission, it sounds very broad and generic, right? It's like a one-liner. If you're applying to the National Institute on Aging, go to their website. In their website, all these institutes and centers have their own mission. You know, it's kind of a remix of the NIH mission, but they also have their individual institute or center strategic plan. And in that strategic plan are their strategic priorities. So if you go in there and you see that they have these strategic priorities and that's how they describe it, what better way to demonstrate alignment of your idea than to reference their own strategic priorities document? And that way, it doesn't have to be a conversation with the reviewers how this aligns with NIH. You're telling them where it aligns with NIH. So demonstrate alignment utilizing their own language, reference their own strategic priorities documents, such that you're making it easy. Like I said, anytime they have to ask themselves how and why, you kind of get scored low because they just assume it doesn't, right? If you don't tell them explicitly that this aligns with the NCI or the NIA, they're going to assume maybe it doesn't because it's not clear. So tell them where the alignment is, and utilize the same language they use to describe it, right? So in the NIA, they have very, very specific language about supporting elder care and advancing health equity outcomes for people as they age, or creating cost-efficient health options or solutions for particular populations. Utilize that same language so that they can see very clearly that you're intentional, your project does align, and this is how. Because they can't give you credit for not aligning it if you use their own words to show the alignment. The innovation section shows how the research could change the current standards or as a paradigm for the field. Depending on the funding opportunity, innovation is about half page, could be up to a page, and you're basically proving that your research will basically contribute to the field. It's different from what's already existing in the field, addresses knowledge gaps, and it can move the research for this field in a substantial direction, a particular way. And you can't just say that, you have to say it and support it with literature. And that's one of the things that they talk about during study section. You can't say, this is novel, this is going to solve this problem, this is going to be great, this is going to be transformative, without showing in the literature, what's already there. Another tip for this section is utilize current literature, right? So you can't say you're addressing a gap and you're citing things from the 1980s. Because yes, those things might have been gaps during the 1980s, but one might assume that there's been significant research that's been done since then. So you want to demonstrate that those gaps are current and that your proposal is addressing current gaps. So utilize citations to support your claims. That's what they're looking for. And then make sure those citations are newer. The approach section, which is where most of your writing for your research strategy lands, is basically how you're going to go about pursuing the specific aims that you stated on your specific aims page. So this needs to be well-reasoned, needs to be logical, it needs to be accomplishable. So if you're going for that 3-year funding period, it needs to be doable in 3 years. And all that needs to be clear. And so one of the things that I've seen very widely is the organization of the approach section, such that reviewers can appreciate whether or not all those components are there. Because what you're wanting to do is you want to describe the methodology, but you want to link it to those specific aims. You want to demonstrate the rationale. So why are you doing this technique when somebody at the study section might be like, oh, they can use this. Why are you using that sample size when they could do this? So you're including all of those elements, which is a lot of detail. One thing that I would advise you to do if you're kind of running up against space for this section, if you're proposing a particular experiment or you're proposing using a particular tool and it's well referenced in publication, cite those publications, because that will be like one quick thing. So, you can do a couple lines on it, cite the publication, so you don't have to go into all the steps. So typically people go, so if it's a technique that's not well published, then yeah, you do want to provide that context and that rationale. But if something that's really well published, just put those citations in there, because reviewers also recognize that you don't have a lot to write, you don't have a lot of substance to your proposal, you spend time with the 2 micrograms will be added to this tube, and spend a lot of time on that, on something that's already well established that you don't have to describe. So utilize this section to talk about how you're going to address those aims. I like to see this section organized by aim, because it makes sense, right? Because you have a lot of techniques. If it's a 3-year project, multiple aspects you're investigating, make sure you line those methods and the appropriate analysis. Don't skip out on the analysis. I've been part of many study sections where they said they didn't talk about the statistics. They didn't, talk about how they're going to confer significance of their findings and things like that, confirm significance of their findings. So you want to be intentional about your space here, making sure it's clear. One of the good ways you can kind of make sure it's clear is hand it to someone who doesn't do the work that you do. If they can read it and it makes sense to them why you want to do what you do, why you chose the techniques that you did, why you chose the sample size that you did, then that's going to help you a long way. Because again, chances are your reviewers might not necessarily be experts in your exact thing. So be intentional about that. Link it to a timeline, because again, they're wanting to see feasibility, right? So certain things can happen in half a year, but realistically, some things are a year-long process. So being intentional about that, linking it that way. Also part of the conversation of feasibility. And then you want to also discuss future directions. And that's also part of the conversation, because they want to say, what's the potential for this, right? So we support it for funding, and then it happens at Radford and that's it. Or it's going to inform future scholarship of this PI or people in the field. So we want to see what that looks like. So mentioning that as well is going to be very important for the approach section. As I mentioned before, the approach section is something that's depending on who's submitting it or where it's coming from. You might have an institutional guidance. We let, Tom, Pam might like to see it look like this. Whatever the case may be, it varies. The NIH doesn't say you have to have it in this particular format. But some are easier to recognize in others and easier for you to appreciate. So here's a sample approach where you align everything that's required underneath each aim. Like I said, if you have a long slate of techniques and a long slate of methods and they're having to map why, okay, this lines up with aim 2, this lines up with aim 3, they're not going to want to do all that work. I think organizing by each aim, including the appropriate context, the rationale, and the methods, is going to be very, very important to, you really want to make reviewers' job easy. As I mentioned, they get a modest honorarium. It's not that much. They're not really going to tease your proposal out like this. Chances are they're going to read it the day before panel, and they're going to have a insightful discussion based on something they just read the night before. So you want to be clear on how you organize this section, because they want to see the components. They want to see the things that explain why this approach, this design, makes sense for the question that's being asked and for the aims that are to be addressed. And so including those things, the statistical considerations and the timeline organized under each aim will be to your benefit, because again, the less amount of time they got to look to make sure you address something, the easier the discussion is going to be, because it was like, well, it's clear. They used the header, they organized it like this, and it's everything maps out or aligned. So you have the opportunity to support your design with literature, preliminary data if you have it, but also be prepared to address any potential limitations or challenges. In this, what they're hoping to see is, most research doesn't always turn out as expected. There might be some limitations, there might be some barriers. They want to see that you as a PI, they don't want to see that the design is perfect and is obviously going to turn out as expected. They want to see that you as a PI have the appropriate expertise to navigate any unforeseen challenges. So you're stating like, this is a limitation. This could yield the following results, which would not be expected. But if it does, we are prepared to respond like this. And so they're actually assessing you when they're reading that, because they're, because like I said, it's like a gray area, because some people want to say, well, if I say there's so many things that could go wrong, then they're not going to support the project. They're going to say the design is flawed. And that's not the case. They want to say that, hey, sometimes science goes wrong and you're prepared to address that, or you have the resources to address that. So including it is recommended as opposed to leaving it out and not addressing it at all. And then again, your statistical considerations, your timeline, and why it's appropriate for the scope and scale of the project. In addition to those two components and the context that's associated with it, you want to describe the involvement of students. Again, they don't want to see 1 week in the summer over 3 years. They want to see, even if it's 5 hours a week during the academic year, more intensive summer experience, whatever that is. You want to speak to that. You want to speak to how you're going to recruit those students. You want to demonstrate, and those are actually my students down there. You want to demonstrate that the number of student contributors to the project weighs more. So you don't necessarily have one student, 10 postdocs, a grad student. You want to have the 10 undergraduate students and then other people working with them. So you want to show that, demonstrate that, highlight how undergraduates are going to contribute to co-authoring publications. You want to describe all that in addition to the science in the same 12 pages that you would pursue any other mechanism at the NIH. So here again, some mistakes to avoid for each of the critical sections of the research strategy. So they kind of the opposite of the things that I said you should do, obviously. So I included these here as a reference. Other components include the biosketch. So in your biosketch, you don't just want to copy paste the one you submit everywhere else. Intentional. You want to align your biosketch with area specific goals. They want to see that you've worked with undergraduates. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a research environment, just describe what it is. So you might not have mentored undergraduate student researchers before, but you've mentored them before, you've advised them. Whatever that interaction is, they want to see that you've done it, because anybody can say, hey, if you give me the money, I'll do the thing, right? But they want to see, hey, I've already had success or I have experience doing this. And if I were to receive the funding, I'd be able to expand and do this. So you want to be intentional about what you share. They want to see the undergraduate interactions. They want to see that you've published. If you have, if you've already engaged undergraduates in publications, highlight that as well. So you want to format your biosketch to this submission because that's what they're going to be looking for. They don't want your generic CV. They don't want your generic biosketch that you submitted to a different funder. And so here are some other points. Some of them I already spoke about, so I won't go into details here. You have the same budget criteria as you would for any other R01. You can request for anything that you need. One thing I mentioned earlier, no generic stipends. You want to say there's student compensation, student wages, and it's going to match the effort. And this is the anticipated or expected effort. And again, work with Tom, Pam, their office to make sure you're following institutional guidance for what that is. So you can't say you're going to pay undergraduates $100 an hour, because then that would create a disparity at the institution where you have some students doing research with Tom and they're getting $100 an hour and some are getting $15 an hour. Follow your institutional guidance. They want to see that if policies already exist, you're following them, and that makes your request fair, right? They're not going to argue with you with what you say you're going to pay your students if you have the supporting document that is embedded in your policy already. So similar to your R01 request, if you pursued R01 before, ask for anything, including collaborator wages, collaborator salaries. If you're collaborating with someone at a different institution, you can pay them as well. You can pay other students. So graduate students, postdocs can be paid from R15 in spite of the undergraduate focus, right? So remember the caveat I mentioned before, you want your number of undergraduates involved. So they don't all have to be full-time on the project. They might be contributing to different aspects of the project, but you want more undergraduates involved than anyone else. And then, so this is what I mentioned earlier. The context for compensation has to align with your institutional policies, and it needs to match their effort. Can't be a blanket number. It has to be demonstrated by the expected effort. And we know that things change. Program officers know that things change, but you got to have a basis or context for any, you have to have a context for any amounts that you request. So a sneeze coming on. Also, a required attachment is a facilities and other documents. Here, you're speaking to the profile of your institution. So you're describing your institution, the types of students you support, approximate number of degrees awarded, what students who complete degrees from your institution go on to pursue. So giving reviewers an idea of what type of institution the proposal is coming from, because they want to get a good sense of, okay, are these institutions that could really benefit from the support of an area R15. So being very intentional about this, if you need access to the numbers, work with your IE office, work with Tom's office, make sure that this profile is in alignment. And also if there's multiple submitters from Bradford, you want to make sure it makes sense. You don't want to describe the institution one way here and say we have, bless you, you don't want to say we have this many percent of, students of a particular background or Pell eligible students, and then somebody else submits something that's completely different. So that's why one of the reasons why you want to make sure you're communicating your intentions and working with your colleagues here. And then the signed provost letter, which must be attached as a PDF. That's another thing that can get something bounced back. If you don't attach it as a PDF, been there before, unfortunately. And that's again attesting to your eligibility. So is this?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
Had to get
We
time.
started late, right?
Okay. It's my fault.
Okay.
We started.
I was just like, maybe this clock is wrong. All right. It's Katie.
11.
Yeah.
But we can adjust.
Okay.
We'll adjust.
Maybe let her know we're gonna adjust. All right, and I'll go through the review criteria. Pretty standard, similar to other NIH submissions. Again, one of the primary differences, they're looking for that undergraduate focus. So similar conversations, similar questions posed as someone pursuing an R01, but area R15 has their own considerations, primarily undergraduate institutions, teaching focused institutions, and institutions that have the ability to expand their research capacity if supported with this award. So similar, you're going to have an overall impact score that's determined. And here are the criteria upon which that's going to be evaluated. So importance of the research, the rigor of the research, and the feasibility, and the expertise or the readiness of the PIs to be successful if funded and carrying out the work or implementing the project. Also some other standard NIH considerations. So again, NIH, one of the largest organizations that funds biomedical research. So they have some very, very specific language as it pertains to any potential hazards associated with projects. So all that is part of the review discussion, whether it be at the study section or during kind of like a technical review by the institute or center. So all those things are going to be addressed or demonstrated via your submission itself or the attachments that you include as part of your submission. Here are ways you can demonstrate institutional support. So again, that provost letter is going to be important. Also, any potential partnerships or collaborations, having letters that speak to that, highlighting expertise in mentoring, access to resources and facilities, any kind of institutional support mechanisms, such as if you have a stats lab that students that are analyzing data can drop in and get some additional help, make mention of that. Your grants office is obviously a big one, right? So, because what they want to do is recognize that if you are funded, you have the people and the resources and the facilities that are going to help you be successful to implement the project. So, including all that, demonstrating a commitment to undergraduate research. So, if it's not you, but you're collaborating with someone who has had success with undergraduate research, speaking to that. A big one is the fact that your institution might have in their strategic plan commitment to undergraduate research or commitment to exposing students to high impact practices, because we know that this helps with the development of skills, preparation for the workforce. So if there's any language like that, that's another way you can demonstrate institutional commitment. Pam's not looking to just go do this thing all willy-nilly, but she can talk to the provost or appropriate official or president and say, hey, this is how this aligns with our strategic plan, or this is how it aligns with our mission, so that reviewers can see, oh, she'll have the support of the institution if this is funded because it aligns with their goals, and they want to be able to say they're checking off things that they've accomplished in alignment with their strategic plan. So there are a number of things that you can do. Sustainability is another one. It's not a requirement, right? So it's not a requirement upon which they're going to say you don't have a institutionalization plan, but it's another way that you can demonstrate institutional support. So if there's an ability for you to say, hey, we're going to do this, and it's going to create a pilot cohort of summer research scholars that hasn't been done at an institution before, and leadership is committed to fundraising after the award period to support this mechanism if success is demonstrated, right? So if you can say that, that's another way. It might not be the case. And again, it's not a requirement, but we're looking to show that the institution is going to support you as a PI if this is funded. And so that support can be demonstrated in a number of ways. It's not like you're the only person doing that thing and they let crazy person do whatever, but no. This speaks to the institution's goals, and they're going to support you with the resources, the facilities, the partnerships that you need to accomplish what you're stating you're going to do in the proposal. And so here I've included just a couple of strategies for success. You want to be clear. You don't have a lot of space, so don't use filler stuff that makes things confusing. You want to be clear. You want to be focused in the research description, research design. You want to talk about your mentorship. Do not talk about mentorship, right? So you want to talk about mentorship. Even if you haven't mentored before, undergraduates, reference frameworks, reference professional societies that have professional development on mentorship. So maybe you're new to research or new to mentoring, and you don't have that you can describe in your bio sketch, but you're committed to taking this training. You're committed to being part of a community of practice around mentorship. such that they have faith that if you're going to succeed in mentoring those students as you stated. Propose a feasible design. And again, you're demonstrating alignment with NIH, whether it be the broader NIH goals or those institute or center specific goals. All right, and then at the end of each session, I've included a couple reference resources that'll help you directly prepare for submissions. So they are there, again, integrated with hyperlinks. And so I encourage you that once you get your today's presentation materials to visit those resources. With that said, I know we're kind of funny on time. So I'm happy to answer any questions during this time and pause. Like I don't have to go through each resource. They're there for you. Are there any questions from the Zoom audience or in the room? All right, with that being said, thank you so much for your time during session 1. And for those of you that are going to continue on to the next session, looking forward to talking more about the National Institutes of Health with you.